Envisioning Narrative Intelligence, a Creative Visual Storytelling Anthology. I'm Brett Halperin, and this is a work that I did with my co-author, Stephanie Lukin. Take a look at these three images here, and in your head, try to come up with a story that you might write about these images. Take a few seconds to do that right now. So some questions to ask yourself is, how did you start that process? Did you start to describe what you saw, or did you start to speculate about the scenery? These are all kinds of questions that we explored in this study on visual storytelling, or the process of deriving stories from images, where we had a lot of different people participate in a process of writing stories about images such as these. Here's an example of a story that someone wrote about these images. It's called When You Least Expect It, Expect It. 3 retirees escape from their care facility. To make it out before anyone notices, they will have to cut through the forest. Good thing they dress warmly. Just after the arc to path opens up wide and they can see freedom ahead. Just when they thought the coast was clear, another arc appears and they hear rustling in the bushes. Could this all be a trap? Will they be sent home? Just then a troll jumps out and says, "I'd like to talk about the extended warranty for your vehicle." They run like they have never run before. So where are we going with this study? Well, this study builds on the premise established in prior work that to teach computers how to generate a story, we need to understand how humans create one first. So essentially, we set up a data collection paradigm for generating stories about images. And we asked this question: what are the varied ways in which human authors approach the same systematic creative process of improvised story building based on image sequences? And so what we do is we essentially collect all these stories to craft an anthology of them that can really function as data to feed into machine learning to support computational visual storytelling. In this work, we contribute to literatures on subjectivities in stories and systems, as well as on computational image-to-text models and automatic visual story generation. So here you can get a sense of our methods for collection and analyses. We collected 100 stories from 73 unique crowdsourced authors from Mechanical Turk. This image on the right here shows one full amount of information that one person provided about these 3 images. So we had each person essentially fill out 4 facets or 4 prompts about each sequence of 3 images that they encountered. And it went as follows. They would first see one image, and then they would fill out an entity facet that says, "What is here?" And they would list the entities and objects, and a scenery facet that would say, "What happens here?" And they would describe the scenery. Then they would see a second image, fill out those 2 prior facets, plus a narrative facet this time that asks them to write a story about what might happen across the 2 images. Then they would see a third image where they would fill out all the prior facets, and then they'd get to the narrative facet, which says to expand on the story that they already started. And then a title facet to title the story. And essentially, we used a sequence of 3 images to scaffold an Aristotelian dramatic structure of setup, climax, resolution, or beginning, middle, and end. And while each image was encountered in a static way, it essentially creates this montage or this sequence of moving images if they were all stitched together. And so we used 2 data sets of images. The first is from a Flickr photo album of images like the ones you see here that are high resolution, vibrant, canonical, studied in prior visual storytelling work. Then we also use what we call a SAR data set, which stands for search and rescue scenario, of low resolution, dimly lit, obscure images of a home under construction. That is computational photography taken with an on-the-ground robot, also from prior work, but not visual storytelling work. And essentially, that is the different images that we used. And we did a close reading and thematic analysis of all the stories and information that was collected to come up with themes about the varied ways that people approach this process. Here you can see the themes, and essentially there's 5 different ones that came out of it. For sake of time, we're going to focus on just 3, but encourage you to read the paper. So the first theme that's really central to what we're doing here is what we call narrating what is envision versus envisioning, which gets at the extent to which people would narrate what is envision or optical versus imagining circumstances beyond the images. So the first layer here is what we call captioning a description. And I also just want to note that themes persisted across image sequences, across image sets, across authors, even sometimes particularly for this theme, in the course of one story, they might fluctuate among these different modes. So an example of capturing a description is what one author wrote: "The trail was covered with leaves that had fallen." Now that you can directly trace back to the image and more or less describes it. The next layer up, though, is what we call commenting a deduction, where another author wrote, "3 friends were taking a Sunday hike." Again, that traces back to that image of 3 people, but there's some level of inference happening here. Maybe those 3 people are friends, maybe they're family members, who knows? But again, it's more or less visible, but there's just some sort of additional layer of interpretation. Whereas the next layer, what we call contriving a deviation, someone wrote, just then a troll jumps out. There's no troll in these images, yet it still like was deciphered through this scenery as potentially emerging. So this is what we call envisioning circumstances beyond the images. Now, the next theme is what we call modulating the mood, where we notice that, again, across image sets, etc., many people would detect an initial mood from the ambiance, the lighting, the aesthetic representation of the environment, and spatial arrangements to detect a mood that would then it would evolve to shape the plot trajectory. So in one case, they would intensify the mood and create this gloom to doom scenario. This story is called Inheritance. We soon moved in and started to update the home and wanted to figure out the drab basement later. It was midnight when I first heard it. We descended downstairs toward the lighted door. On the door was an envelope. Behind this door is a great fortune. He will not harm either of you, but in order to obtain any of the money in there, you must feed him. Fresh meat, flesh, human flesh. The groaning and grinding of a chain across the floor started again. So here we see the mood was initially detected as drab, and then it became intensely drab, to say the least. It became extremely dire. Now, the converse of this is what we call reversing the mood, where again, an initial mood is detected, but it transforms to become a completely opposite type of space, what we call a gloom to bloom scenario. This story is called Faith in the Unseen. Everything will be fine, she says. It just needs a little TLC, she says. All the love in the world couldn't make this place feel like home. She has a vision for this place that I can't see, but I will be supportive and positive. The house was filled with junk and trash. Together with the use of shovels and tons of trash bags, we were able to clean up really well. I taped my poster on the wall and decided that I'll do my best to give our new home a fair shot. So again, we see here that a gloomy mood is detected, but in this case, it blooms, it transforms, it becomes a home with potential to be a place that is special and meaningful. Now, this next theme is what we call encoding narrative biases. And narrative perspective here refers to the perspective through which the authors would fabulate stories. So these are two different stories about the same image sequence. The first is an indigenous perspective, as we call it, and it reads, the American Indian Sioux tribe ran off all white settlers and returned to the traditional native way of life free from interference of the white man. So here we get a sense of what it might be like for an indigenous person to inhabit this space or to write a story about this space, in contrast to the colonial perspective, where another author wrote, send in the jets. The president attempts to control the situation. All clear, one of the pilots says, down on the ground at Lewis and Clark Trail. So here the author ascribes the landscapes to the colonial explorers Lewis and Clark. So we can see that there are very rich implications surrounding who participates in these data collection processes and how they interpret these spaces and what kind of information and perspectives come through the stories. And so this next example of narrative biases is what we call casting of characters. We notice that stereotypes were often encoded in the way that people would characterize the different actors in the stories. And particularly with the search and rescue scenario of the home under construction, a lot of people would cast people facing housing insecurity as the antagonists. And we encourage you to read the paper to really explore these examples, but basically they were often cast as thieves and criminals, which essentially shows how narrative biases can reproduce these old victim-blaming tropes that work to criminalize poverty rather than cultivate empathy and compassion, which can be quite harmful. And so essentially what comes out of this is several discussion points where we essentially match each theme to a particular criteria for how we envision narrative intelligence. And we also match that to a phase of machine learning development, data collection, data labeling, or visual story generation. And so we envision narrative intelligence as creative, expressive, responsible, reliable, grounded. We're going to focus on just this first dimension here for sake of time, but encourage you to read the paper. So creative expression at the forefront. We really call for foregrounding creative expression. In prior work, we noticed that it's more limited to captioning descriptions. It more or less just describes the images rather than really imagines or envisions circumstances beyond it. So here's an example of a story from prior work about these three images. It reads as follows. It was a perfect day for a hike. The setting was beautiful and the weather was just perfect. We came across several overpasses that were picturesque. So that story is very different than the one we generated from someone who wrote about the troll, right? And so we argued that our story elicitation process really foregrounded creative expression in a way that led to this imagination of a troll, which we think is very exciting. And we would like to see machines that in the future allow for this type of creativity. And so in conclusion, we create this computational visual storytelling rubric that assigns each theme to criteria in a phase of development that we believe can be used for artificial intelligence to collect data that leads to more creative stories, responsible stories, expressive, reliable, and grounded. And we have publicly released the anthology for everyone to cross-examine and join us in this exploration. Thank you very much for your time.